So the man who invented modern scientific logic, the guy behind the famous Occam's razor, didn't actually formulate it to champion science. He didn't, create it to help us find the most rational, logical answer to complex problems. He actually came up with it to prove that God could completely rewrite the rules of reality on a whim, defying all human logic in the process.
Yeah, it is. It's honestly one of the greatest ironies in intellectual history. I mean, we associate his name with the absolute pinnacle of strict, no-nonsense reasoning. But his actual goal was to completely sever the connection between divine will and rational intellect.
Exactly. And that historical contradiction is really the perfect entry point for what we are doing today in this deep dive. Because if you look at our modern culture, you've probably felt this intense, almost suffocating pressure to choose sides.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. On one hand, you want to be a logical, rational thinker who respects evidence. But on the other hand, you might want to hold on to some form of spiritual, philosophical, or religious faith. But the narrative out there, especially the one championed by the new atheists over the last couple of decades, it tells you that you just can't have both.
Yeah, it is presented as this really clean binary choice. Like you are either on the team of logic or you are on the team of faith.
Right, like they're locked in a zero-sum game where one can only survive if the other is totally destroyed. But the reality is that the new atheists didn't actually discover this tension between faith and reason. I mean, they weaponized it. They gave this tired faith against reason myth a new corrosive power simply because we, as a culture, completely forgot what those words originally meant.
We really did. They are relying on highly unsophisticated, historically broken definitions.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to trace the centuries-long philosophical custody battle over the concepts of faith and reason. We're going to uncover how two extreme, wildly opposite philosophies manage to distort our understanding of both, and how you can actually spot this trap today.
What's fascinating here is that this isn't just a conversation about religion. I mean, not at all. This is about how we as human beings define truth, logic, and reality itself. The way we define these terms literally dictates how we experience the entire world around us.
Right.
And when you trace the history, you realize that to understand how the definition of faith was broken, we first have to establish what it actually meant before the philosophical extremes took over.
Right. So let's go back to the original blueprint.
Right.
Because historically, faith was broken down into two distinct categories, right?
Yep.
Objective and subjective.
Yes, and that is a really crucial distinction. In classical Christian history, objective faith refers to the totality of saving truths. It's the external data.
Like the scriptures, the creeds, that kind of stuff.
Exactly, the historical teachings. It is the body of knowledge itself. But subjective faith is the internal response to that data. It's the personal belief in that totality of truths.
And the etymology of that subjective faith is where things get really cool. If you trace this back to the Old Testament, this subjective faith is intimately connected to a specific Hebrew word emet, which translates to truth, faithfulness, or trustworthiness.
Right.
And from emet, we get a word that almost everyone listening knows, amen.
Precisely. And amen doesn't just mean I agree or, signal the end of a prayer. Etymologically, it means to be firm or to be solid. It is rooted in a subjective act of trust that is best expressed by the relational phrase, I believe in you.
Okay, let's unpack this. So original subjective faith isn't a blind leap in the dark at all. It's rooted in firmness.
Yes, exactly.
It's like trusting a structural engineer when they tell you a newly built suspension bridge is safe. When you drive your car over that bridge, you aren't just squeezing your eyes shut, crossing your fingers, and hoping gravity takes a lunch break.
Right. That would be terrifying.
Your trust is built on a solid foundation of their demonstrated expertise and the laws of physics. It's a relational trust based on something tangible and firm.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. I mean, it is an informed trust. In the classical view, which was famously championed by medieval thinkers like St. Anselm, the operating principle was faith-seeking understanding.
Faith-seeking understanding.
Yeah. You have this firm foundation of trust, and you actively use your intellect to understand it more deeply. Faith and reason are working together seamlessly. But then we encounter the first major philosophical error that completely derails this harmony. And this is a concept known as fideism.
Fideism. Okay, this is where the train really starts to come off the track.
It really is. Because fideism argues that faith is completely non-rational or even outright irrational. Under this view, faith isn't a firm trust seeking intellectual understanding at all. It relies on the raw human will alone.
So it just throws reason out the window.
Totally. The fideist believes that our natural powers of reason have absolutely no capacity to know God's existence or to make sense of divine revelation. They basically separate faith and reason into entirely disconnected silos of human cognition.
And to really drive home how extreme this gets, there is a famous quote from an early Christian author named Tertullian that perfectly encapsulates the fideist mindset. He famously said, "I believe because it is absurd."
Yes.
I have to stop there and push back because I am struggling to understand why anyone would want their worldview to be absurd. Like, why would you celebrate that?
Well, it stems from a misguided desire to elevate divine power. The thought process is, if God is truly infinite and all-powerful, then his truths must be so far beyond our puny human minds that they appear absurd to us.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so therefore, the more absurd something seems to human logic, the more divine it must be. You go from Anselm's faith-seeking understanding, which implies that reality is ultimately logical and coherent, to Tertullian's idea that absurdity is the actual proof of the divine. In fideism, if there is contrary logical evidence, you just grit your teeth and believe harder. You push your human will against the intellect.
So it becomes a test of endurance rather than a search for truth. But wait, how in the world did Western thought drift from Anselm's beautiful, logical, faith-seeking understanding to this celebration of absurdity? Like, what was the actual mechanism that caused this intellectual divorce?
Well, to find the answer, we have to travel back to the late medieval period and look at a massive scholastic rebellion. Up until this point, St. Thomas Aquinas had established an incredibly intricate balance. He recognized the primacy of the intellect in the human soul.
Right.
Aquinas carefully distinguished between truths found in scriptures, which involve reason, enlightened by faith, and truths discovered by philosophical investigation of the natural world, which involve native, natural reason. But they were entirely complementary.
You're playing on the same team. Truth couldn't contradict truth.
Exactly. But reacting against Aquinas, a group of Franciscan scholastics started pushing back. Drawing on older Neoplatonic currents of thought, they advanced a radical new idea. They argued for the primacy of the human will over the intellect.
Because they thought Aquinas was, what, too strict?
Yeah, they felt that Aquinas was too rationalist, too neat, and ultimately too restrictive on God's freedom.
And this rebellion eventually finds its champion, and the guy we mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive, William of Ockham. Ockham introduces two massive philosophical shifts that basically rewrite the operating code of Western thought.
He really does.
The first one is called nominalism. Let's really ground this because it's a heavy term. What exactly did nominalism do?
Nominalism was a profound shift in how we view reality itself. Before Occam, philosophers generally believed in the objective reality of abstract properties. For example, if you look at a pine tree and an oak tree, they both share the abstract property of treeness. That abstract property, that universal concept, was considered a real foundational part of reality. But Occam entirely denied this. He proposed that only concrete, individual things exist. Abstract properties or natural tines don't exist in reality. They're merely names.
Right, and the Latin word for names is nomina, hence nominalism.
Right. To Occam, these abstractions were just mental tokens, little linguistic shortcuts we use to group similar things together for convenience, but they have no basis in the fundamental structure of the universe.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because as we teased earlier, this philosophy is the origin of Occam's razor, the principle that entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity. Today, we associate Occam's razor with strict scientific logic, the idea that the simplest explanation with the fewest assumptions is usually the right one.
Yes, that's how we use it now.
But historically, it started as this minimalist ontology, a tool specifically designed to tear down the reality of abstract concepts and universal truths.
It is a striking historical irony. He wasn't trying to pave the way for physics. He was trying to clear the deck of eternal concepts. And Occam didn't stop at nominalism, because once you destroy abstract relations, you naturally arrive at his second major shift, which is a theological concept called voluntarism.
Okay, walk us through voluntarism. What is the causal bridge here?
Well, if abstract truths and universal logic don't actually exist, then God isn't bound by them. Voluntarism is the teaching that God's will is not governed by any divine intellect or eternal truths of reason. God's will is entirely, radically free from any constraint.
Okay.
Therefore, moral goodness doesn't exist as an objective, eternal truth that we can discover through reason. What is good only because God commands it.
Wait, so under that logic, if God commanded something completely contrary to human reason tomorrow, like if he commanded that betrayal or cruelty were suddenly virtues, they would be good, simply because he willed it.
Yes.
It completely divorces the divine will from the divine intellect.
Mhm.
Like gravity is just a divine suggestion, morality is arbitrary.
Precisely. And by extension, it divorces the human will from the human intellect. If God's actions are fundamentally arbitrary and unknowable through logic, then human reason is utterly useless for understanding the divine. Faith is no longer about the intellectual apprehension of eternal truth. It's just pure, unadulterated will. You just have to obey.
I'm trying to wrap my head around the historical fallout of this because the ripple effects are staggering. And to be clear for you listening, we are just tracing the philosophical dominoes here as they fell through history. We aren't taking theological sides or criticizing any specific branch of Christianity. But historically, Occam's separation deeply influenced Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation.
It did. Occam's voluntarism heavily influenced Luther's theology of forensic justification. In Luther's framework, God imputes righteousness to the individual Christian. God essentially declares the Christian justified by virtue of their faith alone, even though the individual remains inwardly sinful.
But I'm struggling to see the exact mechanism there. Like, how does stripping away treeness and eternal concepts lead Martin Luther to his specific definition of faith? Connect those dots for me.
The mechanism is trust in the face of an unknowable system. If you accept Occam's premise that God's will is arbitrary and beyond rational comprehension, well, you can't rely on a systematic logical theology to save you. You can't reason your way to God.
Right.
Therefore, Luther proposed that faith is essentially a radical confidence in the certainty of salvation. You can't understand God's mechanics, so you just throw yourself entirely on his mercy.
Ah, I see. It reduces faith to a blind trust, totally stripped of that intellectual grounding that Aquinas had built. It becomes an act of the will, detached from reason, because reason is viewed as broken or useless in the face of the divine.
Exactly. And this fideious mistrust of reason didn't stop with Luther. You can trace this exact same thread through several major Western thinkers over the centuries. You see it in Blaise Pascal in the 17th century. You see it in Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, who grounded faith entirely on moral duty rather than intellectual objective truth.
And then it gets even more diluted as we hit the 19th century, right? We run into thinkers like Friedrich Schleiermacher, and Schleiermacher's looking around at the Enlightenment. The scientific method is brooning, explaining the physical universe left and right.
Yeah, science was taking over.
So, feeling threatened, Schleiermacher basically decides to cede the intellectual territory entirely. He argues that faith is fundamentally just based on feeling and sentimentality, pure emotion. And later, Charles Sanders Peirce viewed faith merely as a product of human instinct.
Right, and notice the trajectory here. We went from faith as a firm, rock-solid trust in objective truths, like the structural engineer analogy you used to, faith as an arbitrary act of the will, and finally to faith as just having a really strong internal feeling.
It's quite a downgrade.
It really is.
Yeah.
And we must ask, why did these brilliant thinkers embrace this retreat? They did it because they thought they were protecting faith. They were trying to build a fortress around it to defend it from the exact opposite extreme, which was rapidly gaining power, and that was theological rationalism.
Right. Because if faith willingly retreats into this corner of blind trust and sentimentality, reason is going to look at that empty intellectual territory and launch a massive counterattack. It's the pendulum swinging wildly in the exact opposite direction. So let's talk about theological rationalism. What is it, and where did it come from?
Theological rationalism is the philosophical outlook that subjects all objects of religious faith and all data of revelation to the ultimate judgment of naked reason. It started brewing in late medieval Europe with groups like the Latin Averroists.
Just to give a quick translation for the listener, think of the Latin Averroists as the radical intellectuals of the 13th century who believed that philosophical reason and theological revelation were completely separate, and that philosophy should essentially ignore theology altogether.
Spot on. That seed was planted, it moved through the Renaissance humanists, and ultimately received its modern, highly structured form from Immanuel Kant.
Kant again. He's really playing both sides of the board here.
He is, because Kant introduced what we call an immanentist view of human reason. He argued that human reason applies only to immanent reality, meaning the here and now. The worldly stuff we can touch, measure, and observe. Meanwhile, he argued that faith applies only to the supernatural, transcendent reality, the world beyond.
Oh, okay. Let's unpack this. So Kant basically built a philosophical panic room for faith. He looked at the home invaders of naked empirical reason breaking down the door, and he said, "Quick, faith, get in the closet."
That's a great way to put it.
He thought he was protecting faith by saying, Reason can't touch you in here, you exist in a totally separate dimension. But by shoving faith into that panic room, he actually just locked it out of the real world entirely.
That is exactly what happened. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, Kant's supposed protection backfired horribly. Because by formally stating that reason only deals with the measurable, physical world, modern theological rationalism eventually morphed and aligned itself with something called scientism.
Scientism, which, we need to be incredibly clear here, is not the same thing as science. Science is a method. It's a brilliant, indispensable tool for observing the physical universe.
Yeah.
Scientism, on the other hand, is a philosophy.
Precisely. Scientism is the philosophical dogma that rejects any form of knowledge other than that derived from the positive or empirical sciences. It claims that if you can't prove it in a laboratory, measure it with an instrument, or express it in a mathematical formula, it literally isn't real knowledge.
And the tragic result of that shift is that suddenly anything outside the hard sciences gets thrown in the cultural garbage bin. Theological knowledge, ethical knowledge, aesthetic knowledge, our fundamental understanding of beauty, of right and wrong, of justice, it all gets consigned to the realm of pure fantasy. Because according to scientism, if you can't put justice in a test tube or look at goodness under a microscope, then goodness is just a fairy tale. It's just chemicals firing in your brain.
It reduces human existence to a very flat, impoverished landscape. So now we have these two incredibly powerful, incredibly flawed extremes dominating the conversation. Fideism tells us that faith is completely irrational, an absurd act of the will, or just a warm feeling. And theological rationalism, wearing the mask of scientism, tells us that reason is exclusively scientific and everything else is a delusion.
So what does this all mean? We have fideism making faith irrational, and theological rationalism making anything non-scientific a total fantasy. It feels incredibly bleak. Is there a way out for you, the listener? Like, how do we escape this false binary?
Well, the way out is to recognize that we don't have to accept their broken definitions. Throughout this entire historical drift, the classical tradition of Western perennial philosophy, and specifically institutions like the Catholic Church, explicitly rejected both of these extremes.
Really? How so?
For instance, in the 19th century, the First Vatican Council issued a dogmatic constitution called De Filius. In it, they formally condemned fideism and affirmed that submission to faith must absolutely be in harmony with reason.
They basically looked at Tertullian and said, no, faith is not about embracing absurdity. Anselm had it right. Faith seeks understanding.
Exactly. But to pull that off, to truly bring faith and reason back into harmony, you also have to firmly reject theological rationalism. You have to reject the idea that reason is only about empirical science. You have to redefine reason itself. Or rather, you have to reclaim its original, much grander definition.
And this brings us to a concept known as right reason. Now, I have to push back here for a second because I want to make sure we truly grasp this. When I hear the word reason today, my brain automatically defaults to the scientific method. I think of spreadsheets, data points, and physical cause and effect. What exactly is right reason if it isn't just modern scientific logic?
It's a great question, because we've all been deeply conditioned by scientism to think small. To the ancient Greeks and Romans, right reason was something much broader and much more profound. It is the intellect's cognitive apprehension of first principles.
First principles.
Yeah, it involves the mind's ability to grasp reality's abstract properties and universal relations, the very things Occam tried to destroy with nominalism. And from that profound grasp, right reason deduces final conclusions that are true about reality as a whole.
Okay, let me try an analogy to see if I'm getting this. So if we're looking at a cup of water, scientism, or modern restricted reason, is just the act of measuring exactly how much water is in the cup. It's quantifying the physical liquid.
Right.
But reason isn't just measuring the water. It's the mind's ability to understand the fundamental concept of capacity in the first place. It's the ability to ask why the cup exists, what its purpose is, and how the concept of a container relates to human thirst. It's a higher-order inquiry.
That is a brilliant analogy. Right. Reason encompasses the measurement, but it doesn't stop there. It grasps the universal truth behind the physical objects. Theological rationalism, by contrast, reduces human reason to a mental habit of deliberately ignoring abstractions.
It just focuses on the water level.
Right. It operates entirely within that nominalist, Occam-style understanding of reality, inferring only physical effects from physical causes. It relies on what is best described as a technocratic logic of the here and now. It deliberately contents itself with a severely impoverished view of truth.
A technocratic logic of the here and now.
Yeah.
That phrase is chilling, honestly, because it perfectly describes the texture of how we argue today. So, bringing this whole journey full circle for you listening, the reason the new atheists in our modern cultural debates seem so frustrating, so toxic, and so utterly gridlocked is that they are quite literally arguing over broken definitions.
They are having the wrong argument entirely.
Exactly. They are pitting a fideist's blind, irrational, sentimental faith against a rationalist's artificially impoverished technocratic reason. It's a rigged game from the start. If you accept their definitions, you are forced to choose between being a mindless zealot or a cold, soulless calculator.
This raises an important question for all of us. Now that we understand this history, how do we engage with the world differently? Understanding this historical and philosophical drift empowers you. It empowers you to spot these false dichotomies when you see them in the media, when you read literature, or just in your daily arguments with friends and family. Knowledge like this is most valuable when it is actively applied to cut through the noise and information overload of our modern culture.
You don't have to accept the premise of the fight. You can reject Kant's panic room entirely. You can demand that faith be grounded in truth, and you can demand that reason be broader, deeper, and more profound than just a chemistry set. And that leaves us with one final lingering idea to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive.
I love this part.
If modern scientism and theological rationalism have reduced reason so much that they automatically categorize ancient theology as pure fantasy, well, look around your life today. Look closely. What other deeply important human experiences are we allowing this technocratic logic to unfairly dismiss?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Think about your deepest, most profound sense of ethics. Think about that overwhelming feeling you get when you stand in front of a breathtaking piece of art or hear a piece of music that moves you to tears. Think about your deepest relationships, the sacrifices you make, and the love you have for your family. Are we really willing to let a broken, minimalist philosophy tell us that all of those profound, guiding realities of human life are just chemical illusions or sentimental fantasies? Or is it time to realize that the structural foundation of our reality is much firmer, much wider, and much more beautiful than the modern world wants us to believe?
That's a powerful thought to leave on.
Next time you feel that pressure to choose between faith and reason, remember you might just be looking at a false choice. Stay curious, keep diving deep, and we'll catch you next time.